Jane Seymour was a figure of quiet grace. Within the loud and often dangerous court of King Henry VIII, she was not known for the fiery wit of Anne Boleyn. She was not known for the regal bearing of Catherine of Aragon. Instead, she possessed a gentle and demure nature that many found calming. Jane was a woman of fair complexion, pale skin, light-colored hair, features that a Tudor audience would have considered the pinnacle of English beauty. Her expression was often described as serene and composed, a stark contrast to the dramatic emotions that frequently swept through the royal palaces. She was a lady-in-waiting, serving Queen Anne. That placed her directly in the line of sight of the powerful and increasingly dissatisfied king. Her choice of attire reflected her modest personality. Other court ladies, influenced by French fashions like Anne Boleyn, wore more daring styles. Jane consistently favoured the traditional English gable hood. The head covering was a structured, house-shaped frame. It completely concealed the hair. It lent an air of pious formality to the wearer. Her conservative style signalled adherence to older, established English customs. It was a visual representation of her character, unassuming, traditional, steadfast. In early 1536, the court was full of tension and whispered secrets. Queen Anne Boleyn's position became increasingly precarious. She had failed to produce the male heir Henry craved. Her bold, assertive personality had alienated powerful men at court. Within this charged atmosphere, Jane moved with quiet discretion. She did not engage in factional politics, nor the clever courtly games. As a lady-in-waiting, she was a silent observer of the unfolding drama, a witness to the Queen's growing anxiety, a witness to the King's wandering eye. Her family, the Seymours, were ambitious and saw in Jane an opportunity. Henry VIII was a man of immense power and volatile moods. To be the object of his affection was both a great opportunity and a terrible risk. Jane navigated the situation with remarkable caution. She presented herself not as a replacement for Anne, but as a contrast. Anne was outspoken and demanding. Jane was placid and obedient. That difference is what drew the king to her. He began to see in Jane the promise of a peaceful and fruitful union, a stark departure from the storm he felt with his current queen. The stage was slowly being set for a dramatic shift in royal fortunes, you know. The spring of 1536 witnessed one of the most shocking events in English history. The downfall of Queen Anne Boleyn was swift and brutal. After years of Henry VIII moving heaven and earth to marry her, his affection had curdled into a deadly resentment. Accusations of adultery, incest, treason were suddenly levied against her, charges historians now see as fabricated. The court watched in stunned silence as the Queen and prominent gentlemen were arrested and imprisoned within the stone walls of the Tower of London. The woman who had once captivated the king and changed England's religion was now fighting for her life, her fate sealed by Henry's desire for a new wife and a male heir. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to a private scaffold on Tower Green. In a final act of controlled dignity, she addressed the small crowd, careful not to defy the king. She was executed not by the common axe, but by a skilled swordsman from France, a small mercy from Henry. Her death sent a terrifying message to the kingdom. No one was safe from the king's wrath. The execution ended an era, clearing the path for Henry's future plans. The court was left reeling, fear and grim anticipation hanging in the air. Even as Anne awaited her fate, Henry was already turning his full attention to Jane Seymour. His courtship was a calculated display of propriety. He sent her gifts and letters, but Jane, guided by her family and her own cautious instincts, returned them. She insisted her honor was her most prized possession, which only inflamed the king's desire. He saw her as the embodiment of virtue, pure and unspoiled, and a worthy mother to his future son. This modesty convinced him she was everything Anne was not. The day after Anne's execution, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. Their wedding took place 11 days later on May 30th, 1536, at Whitehall. The speed was breathtaking, leaving little time for the court or country to process the change. Jane Seymour was now Queen of England. She had risen from a lady-in-waiting to the highest position a woman could hold. Her ascension was tied to her predecessor's tragic fall, a somber reality that must have weighed on her as she began life as the king's third and, hopefully, final wife. Jane Seymour's tenure as queen began under the long shadow of her two predecessors. Her primary role in the eyes of Henry and the kingdom was singular and unambiguous. She was to provide a male heir. This was the great matter that had driven the king to break with the Catholic Church, annul his first marriage, and execute his second wife. The pressure on Jane was therefore immense, far greater than what Catherine or Anne had initially faced. The future of the Tudor dynasty rested squarely upon her shoulders. Unlike Anne, Jane adopted a motto that reflected her understanding of this duty: bound to obey and serve. It declared her subservience to the king's will and her commitment as his dutiful consort. As queen, Jane's conduct modeled traditional femininity and composure. She consciously created a more moral, conservative court atmosphere, in stark contrast to the lively French-influenced court under Anne Boleyn. She implemented stricter rules for the dress and behavior of her ladies-in-waiting, promoting the modesty she embodied. Jane worked to mend relationships fractured during Anne's reign. She encouraged a fragile reconciliation between Henry and his eldest daughter Mary Tudor, who had been disinherited and declared illegitimate. Jane's gentle diplomacy marked her as a peacemaker, a quality Henry deeply appreciated after years of domestic and political strife. The king was utterly captivated by his new wife. He lavished her with affection and praise, calling her his true wife. For Henry, Jane was a safe harbor after the turbulent waters with Anne. Her placid demeanor and unwavering obedience soothed his ego and anxieties. He saw her not as an intellectual equal or political sparring partner, but as a gentle, nurturing figure who would restore order and peace to his life. He believed this marriage was blessed by God, and that Jane would finally give him the son he desperately needed for the security of his realm. For months the court and country held their breath, watching and waiting. Every aspect of the new queen's life was scrutinized for signs of pregnancy. The stakes were incredibly high, not just for Jane and Henry, but for England's stability. Without a clear male successor, the threat of civil war upon Henry's death, similar to the Wars of the Roses, was a very real and terrifying possibility. Jane carried this heavy burden with quietness, her every hope and fear tied to conceiving a prince who would secure the Tudor line and fulfill her destiny as queen. In early 1537, the joyous news the entire nation had been praying for was finally announced. Queen Jane was with child. The court erupted in celebration, and Henry VIII was overcome with happiness and relief. He treated the Queen with reverential tenderness, taking every possible precaution for her safety. On October 12, 1537, after a long labor of 2 days and 3 nights, Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy baby boy at Hampton Court Palace. The child was named Edward. Celebrations erupted throughout England. Bells rang from every church tower. Bonfires were lit in the streets. A Te Deum was sung in St. Paul's Cathedral. A depiction of the christening with Henry proudly looking on as the infant heir is presented. But the triumph was tragically short-lived. In the days following the birth, Jane's health rapidly deteriorated. She had contracted puerperal fever, a common and often fatal postpartum infection. The palace physicians were powerless. The court's joy turned to grave concern and anxious prayer. Henry, his elation shattered, remained by his wife's side, desperate for her recovery. 12 days after the birth, on October 24, 1537, Jane Seymour died. Henry was utterly devastated. He ordered the court into deep mourning and planned a magnificent funeral. Jane's death plunged the king into months of deep depression. The birth of his son was forever linked with the sorrow of his wife's death, a bittersweet victory that would haunt him. Jane Seymour's legacy is unique among the wives of Henry VIII, defined not by a long reign or dramatic political maneuvering, but by a single, momentous achievement. Her primary legacy was giving birth to his only legitimate son, Edward. This secured the Tudor succession and fulfilled the king's deepest desire. For this, Henry forever venerated her. He spoke of her with the utmost respect and affection. He held her up as the standard against which later wives were measured. She was, in his mind, the perfect queen. The depth of his grief and love showed in his final wishes. When he died in 1547, he commanded to be buried beside her St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The ultimate honor, she alone received a queen's funeral. She alone was buried with him. Their connection was immortalized, cementing her status as his one true wife and mother of his heir. Beyond being a mother, Jane's legacy was quiet influence and peacemaking. She worked to heal divisions in the royal family. Her gentle persuasion restored Princess Mary's favor at court. Anne Boleyn would never have done that. Jane represented a return to traditional, conservative queenship, piety, charity, domestic harmony rather than political ambition. She brought calm and stability to Henry's turbulent life. This is the story of Jane Seymour. Her life was short, her reign brief, but her impact was profound and lasting. She is often seen as a tragic figure, a woman who paid the ultimate price for her success, but her story is also one of triumph. She navigated the Tudor court with caution and grace, achieved the goal that eluded two queens before her, secured her place as mother of a king, and became Henry's favorite wife. Her serene image, framed by the gable hood, remains a symbol of the ideal Tudor queen. Jane Seymour was the third wife of King Henry VIII. She gave him a son, Edward Tudor, and though she died in childbirth, she became his favorite wife. Beat.